What would make a teenage girl stand up in the middle of a high-stakes trial, point at a decorated detective, and accuse him of the unthinkable? The courtroom erupts into chaos, but what happens next leaves everyone, including the FBI, completely stunned. Secrets, lies, and a dangerous conspiracy unravel, all triggered by one shocking moment. Stay tuned. This story will leave you questioning everything. Tell us where you're watching from. We love hearing from you. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories that will leave you speechless. Hannah's voice shook, but her words sliced through the courtroom like a blade. Detective Hayes is not who you think he is. The room stilled, as if the air itself had been sucked out. Every eye turned toward the man sitting at the defense table. Marcus Hayes, with his square jaw and sharp suit, didn't flinch. His hands rested calmly on the polished wood, his expression carefully blank. But his eyes, those betrayed something raw, something darker, fleeting, but there. "You're making a serious accusation," the prosecutor said, her voice steady but tinged with curiosity. "Can you explain what you mean, Hannah?" Hannah swallowed hard. Her pulse thundered in her ears, but she forced herself to stand straighter. The world didn't get better by staying silent. "I mean, he's the reason they're dead. He's the one who made it happen." Gasps rippled across the courtroom like an electric current. Whispers swelled into murmurs, rising in intensity until the judge slammed his gavel. "Order," he barked. "Miss Price, do you understand the gravity of what you're saying?" "I do," Hannah said, her voice gaining strength. "And I have proof." The prosecutor arched a brow, clearly taken aback. "Proof? Of what?" "That he was working with them," Hannah said, pointing directly at Hayes. "The same people you're prosecuting now, the gang. He wasn't just investigating them, he was one of them." The room exploded. Shouts from the gallery, the defense lawyer protesting loudly, the judge hammering his gavel in vain. Through it all, Hayes remained still, his gaze fixed on Hannah. For a fraction of a second, his lips quirked into the faintest smile, so fleeting it was almost a ghost. But Hannah saw it. "You're lying," Hayes's lawyer snapped, rising to his feet. "This is slander. Your Honor, I demand that this line of questioning—" "I'm not lying!" Hannah's voice cut through the commotion. Her fists clenched the edge of the witness stand, her knuckles white. "He met with them, I saw it." "You saw what exactly?" the prosecutor asked, her tone shifting to one of careful urgency. She was leaning in now, her earlier doubt replaced by the sharpness of a predator sensing blood. "Tell us, Hannah." Hannah hesitated. She could feel everyone watching her, the weight of their expectations pressing down like a lead blanket. But she also knew the truth couldn't stay buried forever. "There was a night," she said finally, her voice trembling but clear. "Months ago, I saw him meet with one of their leaders. They didn't see me, but I saw them. He handed them something, papers, money, I don't know. And then he left. The next day, my mother—" Her voice cracked, but she pushed through it. "My mother disappeared." The silence that followed was deafening. Even the judge looked shaken. The prosecutor's expression hardened. "Are you saying your mother's disappearance is connected to Detective Hayes?" Hannah nodded slowly. "Yes, and I think he knows why." Hayes leaned back in his chair, finally breaking his silence. His voice, when it came, was smooth, almost amused. "With all due respect, Your Honor, this is ridiculous. She's a scared kid looking for someone to blame." But his words landed hollow. They lacked the outrage of an innocent man, the conviction of someone unjustly accused. Instead, they carried a calculated calm, the kind designed to deflect rather than deny. "Enough," the judge said, his voice weary but firm. "Miss Price, you've made a serious claim. This court will recess while we determine—" Before he could finish, the heavy doors at the back of the courtroom swung open. Two men in dark suits strode in, their movements precise, their faces unreadable. They moved with the quiet authority of men who didn't need to explain themselves. The room seemed to shrink in their presence. "Apologies for the interruption, Your Honor," one of them said, pulling a badge from his pocket. "Special Agent Carter, FBI. We need to speak with the witness immediately." The judge frowned. "This is a court of law. You can't just—" It's a matter of national security, Carter interrupted, his voice flat but immovable. He turned to Hannah, his expression softening only slightly. Miss Price, you're coming with us. Hannah froze, her mind racing. Her gaze darted to Hayes, who now sat perfectly still, watching her with a quiet intensity. There it was again, that flicker of something dark in his eyes. Not panic, not fear, something closer to triumph. No, Hannah whispered under her breath, her pulse roaring in her ears. She didn't know why, but something about this felt wrong. The agents weren't here to help her. She was sure of it. And then Hayes smiled. Not a ghost of a smile this time, but a full, deliberate curve of his lips, just wide enough for her to see. The corridor outside the courtroom was cold and sterile, the fluorescent lights humming faintly overhead. Hannah's footsteps echoed as the FBI agents escorted her toward a secure conference room. Her heart pounded in her chest, every step feeling heavier than the last. She tried to slow her breathing, to make sense of what was happening, but the look Hayes had given her before she left the courtroom lingered in her mind. It wasn't the look of a man worried about his innocence. It was the look of someone playing a game only he understood. Right in here, Agent Carter said, holding the door open. His tone was brisk, professional, but not unkind. The other agent, a younger man with a tight jaw and an unreadable expression, stepped in first, checking the room before gesturing for her to enter. Hannah hesitated. "What is this about?" she asked, her voice trembling despite her effort to sound calm. "We just have a few questions," Carter said, his tone carefully neutral. "You've done a brave thing today, Miss Price, but we need to ensure we have all the facts." She stepped inside cautiously, her eyes darting around the room. The walls were bare, the table plain and metallic. It felt more like an interrogation chamber than a safe space. The door clicked shut behind her, and the sound made her stomach churn. "Sit," Carter said, gesturing to one of the chairs. She sat down slowly, clutching her hands together in her lap. The younger agent sat across from her, setting a recorder on the table while Carter leaned against the wall, arms crossed, observing her carefully. "Let's start simple," the younger agent said, his voice softer than she expected. "Tell us how you know Detective Hayes." Hannah looked between the two of them, her throat dry. "I don't," she said. "Not personally. But you just accused him of orchestrating a murder and conspiring with a known gang," Carter interjected, his tone sharper. "That's not exactly a casual claim." Hannah felt the weight of their scrutiny, their skepticism thinly veiled beneath professional politeness. "I saw him," she said firmly. "Meeting with the gang leader. It was late at night near the docks. I didn't know who he was at first, but later I saw his picture in the news." The younger agent nodded, jotting down notes. "And this was the same gang involved in your mother's disappearance?" She nodded, her throat tightening. "Yes, she was trying to expose them. She had evidence, documents, pictures. She told me to stay hidden no matter what. And then she was gone." Carter's eyes narrowed. "And you believe Hayes was responsible for that?" "I know he was," she said, her voice breaking. "I've spent months trying to figure out what happened. Following leads, piecing things together. He's tied to them, I'm sure of it." The younger agent leaned forward, his expression softening. "Hannah, what you're saying is serious. If we're going to pursue this, we need to know if there's anything else. Something you're not telling us." Hannah froze. She could feel their eyes boring into her, waiting for her to slip, to reveal something they could use against her. She thought about the sketchbook hidden in her bag, filled with drawings and notes. Every detail she could remember from the night she saw Hayes at the docks. But she wasn't ready to hand it over. Not yet. "That's all I know," she said quietly. Carter pushed off the wall, his expression unreadable. "You understand the implications of lying to a federal agent, right?" "I'm not lying," she snapped, her voice rising. "Why don't you go ask him why he was meeting with criminals in the middle of the night? Why don't you ask him about the offshore accounts and the money laundering?" The agents exchanged a glance, something unspoken passing between them. Carter nodded, and the younger agent switched off the recorder. "All right," Carter said, his voice suddenly softer. "We're done for now. You'll stay in protective custody while we investigate further." Hannah stood, her legs shaking. "You believe me, don't you?" Carter's expression remained neutral. "We'll see." As they led her out of the room, a sense of unease settled over her. She didn't trust them, not fully. Something about the way they looked at each other, the way they questioned her, felt off. And as they escorted her down the hallway, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was still being watched. She glanced over her shoulder, half expecting to see Hayes standing there. But the hallway was empty. Still, his smirk lingered in her mind, a haunting reminder that the game had only just begun. The black SUV carrying Hannah rolled smoothly through the dimly lit streets, its tinted windows cutting her off from the outside world. The silence inside was oppressive, broken only by the occasional murmur of the agent's radios. She sat in the back seat, clutching her bag tightly against her chest. Inside it was her sketchbook, her only proof, her lifeline. Agent Carter sat in the passenger seat, scrolling through his phone, while the younger agent, whom she'd learned was named Agent Davis, drove in focused silence. Neither of them had spoken much since they left the courthouse. Hannah stared at the back of Carter's head, questions swirling in her mind. "Where are you taking me?" she asked finally, her voice cutting through the stillness. "To a safe house," Carter replied without looking back. "Somewhere secure, where we can keep you protected." "Protected from what?" she pressed, her tone edged with frustration. "If you believe me, why aren't you arresting Hayes right now?" Carter sighed, turning slightly in his seat to face her. "It's not that simple, Hannah. What you've said raises a lot of questions, but we need more than accusations to act. We need hard evidence." "I told you I have proof," she said, her grip tightening on her bag. Carter raised an eyebrow. "And what kind of proof is that?" Her heart raced. She wasn't sure if she could trust him, or anyone for that matter. Something about the way he deflected her questions, the way his answers felt rehearsed, made her uneasy. "I'll show you when I'm ready," she said quietly. He studied her for a moment before nodding. "Fair enough." The car turned onto a quieter road, the streetlights thinning out as they approached the outskirts of the city. The silence returned, heavier now. Hannah's mind raced with possibilities. What if the safe house wasn't safe at all? What if they were leading her into a trap? She glanced at Agent Davis in the driver's seat. His hands gripped the wheel tightly, his jaw clenched. He hadn't said much, but there was something about him, an edge to his silence, a tension that felt out of place. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sudden ring of Carter's phone. He answered it briskly, his voice lowering as he spoke. "Yeah, we're en route now." "No, not yet. I'll handle it." Hannah strained to hear the other side of the conversation, but the voice was muffled. Carter hung up and turned to Davis. "Take the long route. I don't want any surprises." Davis nodded, his gaze flickering to the rearview mirror where it met Hannah's for a brief moment. She quickly looked away, her pulse quickening. "Why the long route?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "Just a precaution," Carter said. "We don't take chances in situations like this." The words sounded logical, but they didn't ease the gnawing unease in her gut. She shifted in her seat, her eyes darting to the window. The streets were emptier now, the buildings fewer and farther between. In the distance, she could see the faint glow of the city behind them, growing smaller with every mile. And then suddenly the car slowed. Davis glanced at Carter, his expression sharp. "We've got a tail." Hannah's breath hitched. "What do you mean, a tail?" Carter twisted in his seat to look behind them. "Stay calm," he said, his voice steady but firm. "Davis, lose them." The SUV accelerated, its engine roaring as Davis veered onto a side street. Hannah gripped the seat, her heart pounding in her chest. She glanced out the rear window and saw another car following them, its headlights glaring like predatory eyes. "Who is it?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Is it them?" Carter didn't answer. Instead, he pulled a gun from his holster, checking the chamber before turning back to Davis. "Get us out of here." The SUV swerved sharply, throwing Hannah against the door, Her bag slipped from her lap, spilling its contents onto the seat. The sketchbook tumbled open, revealing a page filled with detailed drawings of faces, places, and symbols. Carter's eyes flicked to it for a split second, his brow furrowing. "What the hell is that?" he demanded. "Nothing," she snapped, scrambling to shove the sketchbook back into her bag. But before she could, he grabbed it, his grip firm. "Stop!" she yelled, panic rising in her chest. "That's mine!" "We don't have time for this," Davis shouted from the front, his voice breaking the tension. The SUV lurched again as he took a sharp turn, tires screeching against the asphalt. Carter flipped through the pages, his expression darkening with every sketch he saw. "Hannah," he said slowly, "where did you get this?" Her throat tightened. "I drew it. It's everything I remember." His eyes narrowed, his voice lowering. "These symbols, this isn't just some memory, this is—" The car jolted violently as something hit them from behind. Hannah screamed, clutching the seat as Davis fought to regain control. The vehicle swerved, skidding to a halt on the shoulder of the road. "Get out!" Carter barked, throwing open his door. "Now!" Hannah hesitated, her mind racing. Before she could move, Carter grabbed her arm and pulled her out of the car. The night air was cold against her skin, the sound of approaching footsteps sending a fresh wave of fear through her. "Stay behind me," Carter ordered, his gun drawn. Davis was already out, his weapon trained on the dark shape of the approaching car. Hannah's heart thundered as the figures emerged from the shadows, their faces obscured. And then she saw it, the unmistakable silhouette of Marcus Hayes stepping into the dim light. His expression calm, his hands raised in mock surrender. "Well," he said, his voice carrying a chilling ease, "isn't this a surprise?" Hannah's legs felt like they might give out beneath her. Marcus Hayes stood before them, the faint smirk on his face making her stomach churn. He was unarmed, his hands held loosely at his sides as though he hadn't just forced their car off the road. Behind him, 3 more figures emerged from the shadows, each holding a weapon. Carter didn't flinch. His gun was steady, trained on Hayes' chest. "Don't take another step," he warned, his voice sharp. "This ends now." Hayes tilted his head, his smirk deepening. "Oh, Carter, always so dramatic. If I wanted this to end, it would have ended already." He glanced at Davis, who shifted uneasily, his finger hovering over the trigger. "Relax, kid. You don't want to do something you'll regret." "You're outnumbered, Hayes," Carter said, his tone icy. "You really think you can talk your way out of this?" Hayes chuckled, the sound low and unsettling. "Outnumbered? You might want to double-check your math." He gestured behind Carter, and Hannah's breath hitched as she turned to see 2 more men emerging from the darkness, their weapons drawn. Davis cursed under his breath, his grip tightening on his gun. "We've got company," he muttered. Carter's jaw clenched. "Hannah, stay behind me," he said without looking at her. His voice carried an authority that left no room for argument, but Hannah's mind was racing too fast to process his command. Hayes was here. He'd come for her. She wasn't sure if that was terrifying or validating. "What do you want?" Carter demanded, his gun unwavering. Hayes sighed, as though the question bored him. "What I've always wanted," he said, his gaze flickering to Hannah. "The truth, and this little artist here seems to know more about it than anyone else." Hannah's hands clenched into fists. "You're a liar," she spat, the words escaping before she could stop them. Her voice was louder than she expected, shaking but defiant. "You don't care about the truth, you just want to cover your tracks." Hayes raised an eyebrow, clearly amused. "Feisty, aren't you? Your mother was the same way, always asking questions, always digging where she didn't belong." "Don't talk about her," Hannah shouted, her voice cracking. Carter shot her a warning look, but Hayes' attention was fixed on her now, his smirk fading. For the first time, there was something colder in his expression, something calculating. "Do you even know what she was trying to do?" Hayes asked, taking a slow step forward. "Do you know how deep this goes? Or are you just a kid playing detective with your little notebook?" "That's enough," Carter barked, taking a step forward to block Hayes' path. "You don't get to intimidate her. Not here. Not now." Hayes raised his hands again, a mock gesture of surrender. Intimidation. Carter, I'm just having a conversation. You're the one waving a gun around. Davis shifted his stance, his gun sweeping to cover one of Hayes's men, who had taken a step too close. Back off, he growled, his voice steadier than before. The tension was suffocating, every second dragging out like an eternity. Hannah's mind raced. Hayes had mentioned her mother, something he hadn't done before. He was trying to rattle her, but why? What did he know? You said she was digging, Hannah said suddenly, her voice cutting through the standoff. What was she looking for? What scared you so much you had to get rid of her? Hayes turned his head slightly, his eyes narrowing as they met hers. Scared, he repeated, as though the word offended him. Oh no, Hannah. Your mother wasn't scary. She was predictable. A pawn in a game she didn't even know she was playing. Hannah's chest tightened. You killed her. His silence was louder than any answer could have been. Enough games, Hayes, Carter said, his voice filled with barely restrained anger. Whatever you're planning, it's over. Put your men down and step away. Hayes smiled faintly. You really don't get it, do you? He said softly. This isn't a game. It's a checkmate. You're out here chasing ghosts while the people pulling the strings are 10 moves ahead. And you, Carter, you're just another pawn. Before anyone could respond, the silence was shattered by the deafening crack of a gunshot. One of Hayes's men crumpled to the ground, and in an instant, chaos erupted. Carter and Davis opened fire, their movements precise and controlled, while Hayes's remaining men returned fire, their bullets lighting up the night. Hannah hit the ground instinctively, her arms covering her head as the gunfire roared around her. She felt someone grab her arm, pulling her roughly to her feet. She screamed, but when she looked up, she saw Carter's face, his expression grim. Run, he shouted, shoving her toward the tree line. I can't, she started, but he cut her off. Go, now! Without thinking, she turned and ran, her heart pounding as she sprinted into the darkness. The sound of gunfire faded behind her, replaced by the crunch of leaves and the ragged sound of her own breathing. She didn't know where she was going, she only knew she had to get away. And as she ran, one thought repeated in her mind. Hayes wasn't done. Not by a long shot. Hannah's lungs burned as she pushed herself deeper into the woods, her legs trembling with exhaustion. Branches scraped against her arms, and the uneven ground threatened to trip her with every step. The chaos of the gunfight behind her had faded into silence, replaced by the unnerving rustle of leaves and the distant echo of her own hurried footsteps. She slowed to catch her breath, leaning against a tree. Her mind raced, replaying the last few moments over and over. The gunshot. Carter yelling at her to run, Hayes's words. Checkmate. None of it made sense, and yet it all felt terrifyingly calculated. She reached for her bag, clutching it tightly as if it were the only thing tethering her to reality. Inside was the sketchbook, her proof, her voice in a world where no one seemed to believe her. She opened it with trembling hands, flipping past sketches of faces she'd memorized, symbols she didn't fully understand, and a dockyard scene burned into her memory. Her mother's face stared back at her from the next page. Hannah had drawn it from memory, the lines softer, more careful than the rest. Tears pricked at her eyes as she ran her fingers over the image. Mom, she whispered, her voice cracking. What did you know? A sudden snap of a branch nearby jolted her out of her thoughts. She froze, her breath catching in her throat. Someone was there. She glanced around wildly, the shadows of the trees twisting and shifting in the dim moonlight. Hannah. The voice was low, calm, and far too familiar. It sent a chill racing down her spine. She turned slowly, and there he was. Marcus Hayes stood a few feet away, his figure partially obscured by the darkness. His hands were empty, no gun in sight, but his presence was no less threatening. How did you? She stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. Find you? Hayes finished, stepping closer. You ran straight into the woods, not exactly subtle. Hannah backed away, her heart hammering against her ribs. Stay back. He raised his hands in mock surrender, a faint smile playing on his lips. I'm not here to hurt you, Hannah. You're lying, she snapped, her voice shaking. You've been lying this whole time. Hayes tilted his head, studying her like a puzzle he was trying to solve. And what lies have I told exactly? Enlighten me. You killed my mother, she said, her voice rising. You're working with them, with the gang. I saw you at the docks. I know what you've done. Do you? Hayes asked, his tone calm, almost curious. Or do you know what someone wanted you to see? Her brow furrowed, confusion cutting through her fear. What are you talking about? Hayes stepped closer, slowly, deliberately. You're smart, Hannah, smarter than most people in that courtroom, but you're playing a game you don't understand. He gestured toward her bag. That notebook of yours, those symbols, those faces, they're not just random. Someone wanted you to find them. She clutched the bag tighter. No one gave me anything. I saw them myself. Hayes nodded, as if he'd expected that answer. And how do you think they knew you'd be watching? Your mother wasn't working alone. She was following orders. Orders from people who don't care if you or I survive this. You're lying, she repeated, but her voice faltered. Doubt crept in like a shadow, curling around the edges of her conviction. Am I? Hayes said, his voice softening. If I wanted to hurt you, don't you think I would have done it by now? But instead I'm here, risking everything to warn you. Warn me about what? Hayes stepped closer, and this time she didn't move away. His voice dropped to a near whisper. The FBI isn't your friend, Carter, Davis. They don't want to protect you. They want what's in that notebook. Her grip on the bag tightened. Why? What's in here that's so important? Hayes sighed, glancing over his shoulder as if expecting someone to appear from the darkness. The same thing your mother was trying to protect. Evidence of something bigger than you or me. Hannah shook her head, her mind reeling. You're just trying to confuse me, make me doubt them. And what have they told you? Hayes countered. That they're the good guys? That I'm the villain? He leaned in slightly, his voice dropping lower. Trust your instincts, Hannah. Who's been following you, protecting you, not them, me. A sudden rustling behind her made her spin around, her pulse spiking. In the distance, she saw flashlights cutting through the trees, accompanied by faint voices calling her name. It's Carter, she whispered, relief washing over her. Hayes grabbed her arm, his grip firm but not painful. If you go with them, you'll never see that notebook again, and you'll never find out what really happened to your mother. Hannah hesitated, her thoughts spiraling. The flashlights grew closer, the voices louder. Hannah! Carter's voice rang out, filled with urgency. She turned back to Hayes, her mind torn. Why should I trust you? His eyes met hers, steady and unflinching. Because you already know I'm telling the truth. You just don't want to admit it. The flashlight beams broke through the darkness, and she had seconds to decide. Her heart thundered in her chest as she glanced between Hayes and the approaching agents. One path led to safety, or so they claimed. The other led to the man she feared most but couldn't entirely doubt. Her grip on the bag tightened. Stay back, she whispered to Hayes, her voice breaking. He nodded once, stepping away into the shadows. You'll see, he said softly. Sooner or later, you'll see. Carter's figure emerged from the trees, his face grim. Hannah, are you okay? Did he hurt you? She hesitated, glancing back toward where Hayes had disappeared. The darkness swallowed him whole, leaving her with more questions than answers. No, she said quietly. He didn't hurt me. Carter crouched in front of her, his hands on her shoulders, his eyes scanning her face for signs of injury. Are you sure you're okay? He asked, his voice steadier now but still tinged with urgency. What did he say to you? Hannah nodded stiffly, her grip tightening on her bag. I'm fine, she said, her voice flat. He said a lot of things. Like what? Davis asked, stepping into view, his gun still drawn and his gaze sweeping the woods. He looked tense, ready for another ambush. Hannah hesitated, her mind replaying Hayes's words. The FBI isn't your friend. They want what's in the notebook. A knot of uncertainty tightened in her stomach, but she shook her head. Nothing that made sense. He's just trying to mess with me. Carter studied her for a moment longer, his eyes narrowing. "Did he touch you? Hurt you in any way?" "No," she said quickly, pulling away from his grasp. "I said I'm fine." Davis holstered his gun, his expression grim. "We need to get out of here before he comes back with reinforcements." Carter stood, nodding. "Agreed. Let's move." He turned to Hannah, his voice softening slightly. "We're taking you somewhere safer. This time, we won't let him get near you." Hannah didn't argue, but as they began walking back toward the road, her mind raced. Every step felt heavier, weighed down by the questions Hayes had planted in her mind. She kept her bag close to her chest, her heart pounding each time Carter or Davis glanced her way. They reached the SUV, now parked awkwardly on the shoulder of the road, one side dented from the earlier collision. Davis checked the vehicle for damage while Carter opened the back door, motioning for Hannah to get inside. She climbed in without a word, sliding into the far corner of the seat. As the agents got in and the car pulled away, the silence inside was oppressive. The hum of the engine did nothing to drown out the thoughts swirling in her head. She replayed every word Hayes had said, searching for lies, for manipulation, but also for truths she couldn't ignore. Carter broke the silence first. "Hannah, if there's anything you're not telling us, now's the time. Whatever Hayes said to you, it's important we know." She looked up sharply, her pulse spiking. "I told you everything," she said defensively. "He was just trying to scare me." Carter's eyes flicked to the rearview mirror, meeting hers. "You're sure about that?" "Yes," she said, her voice firm but brittle. "I'm sure." He nodded slowly, but his expression didn't change. Davis, in the driver's seat, glanced at him briefly before focusing back on the road. The tension between them was palpable, but neither said anything more. The SUV sped down the empty highway, the city lights long behind them. Hannah stared out the window, the trees blurring into shadows. Her fingers absently traced the edges of her bag, her mind racing. After what felt like hours, the SUV turned onto a gravel road, the tires crunching loudly as they approached a small, nondescript cabin nestled in the woods. The structure was plain, almost forgettable, with a single porch light casting a dim glow. It didn't feel safe. It felt isolated. "This is it," Davis said, parking the car. He opened his door and stepped out, scanning the perimeter while Carter gestured for Hannah to follow him inside. She hesitated at the door, her instincts screaming at her to stop, but Carter was already unlocking it, his movements brisk and practiced. "Come on," he said over his shoulder. "The sooner we're inside, the safer you'll be." Hannah forced herself to follow, stepping into the cabin. The interior was sparse but functional, a small sitting area with a couch and a table, a kitchenette in the corner, and two closed doors that she assumed led to bedrooms. There were no personal touches, no signs of life. It felt temporary, like a holding cell. Carter turned to her, his tone measured. "You'll stay here until we get this sorted out. We've got people tracking Hayes. It's only a matter of time before we bring him in." She nodded mutely, her eyes darting around the room. "Where will you be?" "Nearby," Carter said. "We'll take shifts watching the place. You won't be alone." Davis entered behind her, setting a black duffel bag on the table. "Surveillance equipment," he explained, pulling out a small camera and setting it on the windowsill. "If Hayes shows up again, we'll know." Hannah's chest tightened. "And if he does?" Carter met her gaze, his expression hard. "Then we'll handle it." He turned back to Davis, who was adjusting a second camera. Their quiet, efficient movements unsettled her. They were too controlled, too precise, as if they were preparing for something they weren't telling her. The weight of the notebook in her bag felt heavier than ever. "They want what's in there." Hayes's voice echoed in her mind, and she couldn't shake the feeling that he was right. She glanced at the window, at the dense forest beyond. It felt like the walls were closing in, and for the first time, she wondered if she'd made the wrong choice. Hannah sat down on the couch, pulling her bag onto her lap. She needed time to think, to figure out her next move. But deep down, she knew time wasn't on her side. Hayes was still out there, and whatever game he was playing, she was a part of it, whether she wanted to be or not. The night stretched on, quiet and oppressive. The only sounds in the cabin were the faint hum of the surveillance equipment and the soft crackle of the radio on Carter's belt. Hannah sat on the couch, her bag still clutched to her chest, while Carter paced near the door. Davis had taken up a position by the window, his sharp eyes scanning the woods outside. "You should try to get some sleep," Carter said, his voice softer than before. "You'll think more clearly after some rest." Hannah didn't respond. Her fingers traced the edge of the notebook through the fabric of her bag, her mind a storm of conflicting thoughts. Sleep was impossible, not with everything Hayes had said circling in her mind like a dark cloud. "The FBI isn't your friend. They want what's in the notebook." Her eyes darted to Carter, who had stopped pacing and was now leaning against the wall, his arms crossed. He caught her looking and offered a faint, tired smile. "I know it's been a long day," he said, "but you're safe here. We won't let anything happen to you." The words felt hollow, like they were meant to reassure her but carried no weight. Hannah forced a nod and looked away, her chest tightening. She could feel their eyes on her, watching, assessing, waiting for her to slip. Davis broke the silence, his voice low. "You're sure Hayes was unarmed?" Hannah looked up, startled by the question. "Yes," she said quickly. "He didn't have a gun." Davis frowned, his gaze still fixed on the woods. "Doesn't make sense. He's not the type to show up unprepared." "Maybe he wanted to rattle her," Carter suggested. "Get inside her head." "Well, it worked," Davis muttered, shooting a glance at Hannah. She's spooked. "I'm right here," Hannah snapped, the words slipping out before she could stop herself. "You don't have to talk about me like I'm not." Davis raised an eyebrow, surprised by her outburst, but said nothing. Carter stepped forward, his expression calm. "He didn't mean anything by it," he said. "We're just trying to figure out his angle." "His angle," Hannah repeated, her voice rising. "His angle is that he's been working with criminals for years, and no one did anything about it." Carter nodded slowly, his tone measured. "And we're going to make sure he answers for that. But we need your help, Hannah. Anything you can tell us, anything at all, could make the difference." Her grip on the bag tightened. She thought of the notebook and everything inside it. The faces, the symbols, the memories she'd poured onto its pages. It was her proof, but it was also her burden. If she handed it over, she'd lose the only leverage she had. "I already told you everything I know," she said finally, her voice quiet but firm. "There's nothing else." Carter's jaw tightened, but he didn't push. Instead, he exchanged a glance with Davis, who gave a small shrug and returned to his post by the window. The tension in the room was suffocating, and Hannah felt her chest tighten with each passing second. She needed air, needed space to think. "I'm going to the bathroom," she said abruptly, rising to her feet. Carter nodded, stepping aside to let her pass. "Take your time." She walked down the short hallway, her steps quick and purposeful. Once she was inside the small bathroom, she locked the door behind her and leaned against it, her heart racing. Her hands trembled as she unzipped her bag and pulled out the notebook, flipping through the pages. The sketches stared back at her, vivid, haunting, and painfully familiar. The dockyard, the men in shadows, the symbol etched into the crates, one she'd drawn over and over again. An intricate looping design that seemed meaningless at first glance but felt impossibly significant. She traced the lines with her finger, her thoughts spinning. What had Hayes meant when he said her mother wasn't working alone? And why was this symbol the one thing she couldn't stop drawing, no matter how hard she tried? A knock on the door startled her, and she quickly shoved the notebook back into her bag. "Hannah?" Carter's voice called from the other side. "Everything okay in there?" "Yeah," she said quickly, her voice tight. "I'll be out in a second." She splashed water on her face, trying to steady her breathing. When she looked at herself in the mirror, she barely recognized the girl staring back. Her eyes were wide with fear, her face pale and drawn. She looked like someone who had seen too much and still didn't understand enough. Taking a deep breath, she zipped up her bag and opened the door. Carter was standing a few feet away, his expression neutral but watchful. "You good?" he asked. "Yeah," she said, brushing past him. "I'm fine." She returned to the couch, sitting down and pulling her bag close once more. Carter watched her for a moment longer before returning to his position near the door. Davis shot her a quick glance but said nothing. As the minutes dragged on, the cabin grew quieter, the weight of the night pressing down on all of them. Hannah's mind raced with possibilities, questions, and fears. She didn't know who to trust, but one thing was clear. Whatever was in that notebook, it was dangerous enough to make her a target, and that meant she had to protect it, no matter what. As she sat in the suffocating silence, a faint, muffled sound reached her ears. It was distant but unmistakable. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, and coming from outside the cabin. Her eyes shot to Davis, who stiffened immediately, his hand moving to his weapon. Carter noticed too, his body tensing as he signaled for silence. The three of them froze, listening intently. The footsteps grew louder, circling the cabin. Then came a faint, deliberate knock at the front door. No one moved. The knock came again, louder this time, and a voice followed, low, calm, and far too familiar. "Hannah," Marcus Hayes called. "It's me, we need to talk." The room felt like it had stopped breathing. Hannah stared at the door, her heart pounding so loudly she was sure everyone else could hear it. Hayes's voice, calm and deliberate, drifted through the heavy silence. "Hannah," he said again, his tone almost casual. "I know you're in there. We both know you have questions. Let me answer them." Carter motioned for Davis to cover the window while he drew his gun and stepped closer to the door. His voice was low, measured. "Hannah, stay back." Hannah didn't move. She clutched her bag tighter, her mind spinning. How did he find us? How is he always one step ahead? Hayes knocked again, louder this time. "You don't trust them, do you?" he said, his voice carrying a faint edge of amusement. "They're keeping things from you, just like they did with your mother." "Enough," Carter barked, his gun trained on the door. "Hayes, step away now, or we will engage." Hayes chuckled softly. "Engage? Really, Carter? Is that the line we're using tonight?" Davis's voice came from the window, tense but quiet. "I don't see anyone else out there. He's alone." "That doesn't mean anything," Carter said, his eyes narrowing. "Stay sharp." Hannah felt trapped between the tension in the room and the magnetic pull of Hayes's voice. He was lying. He had to be. But his words burrowed into her mind, stirring doubts she couldn't shake. "I know about the notebook," Hayes said, his voice dropping just enough to make it almost conspiratorial. "I know what's in it, and I know they want it." Carter stiffened. "Don't listen to him," he said to Hannah without looking back. "He's manipulating you. That's what he does." Hayes chuckled again, the sound somehow both unsettling and amused. "Am I? Or are you just worried she's starting to figure things out?" "Enough games, Hayes," Carter snapped. "Walk away now, or this ends here." Hayes's voice softened, almost as if he was speaking directly to Hannah. "Your mother trusted the wrong people, Hannah. Don't make the same mistake." Hannah's breath hitched, and Carter turned to look at her. "Don't listen to him," he said firmly, his eyes locking onto hers. "Whatever he's saying, it's a distraction. He's trying to buy time." But Hannah wasn't so sure. Every word Hayes said felt like a puzzle piece, fitting together with things she hadn't understood before. Her mother's secrecy, the symbols, the constant feeling that there was more going on than anyone was telling her. "I'll give you one chance," Carter said, his voice hardening as he turned back to the door. "Leave now." There was a long pause, the kind that stretched out endlessly, thick with unspoken tension. Then finally, Hayes spoke again, his voice calm and measured. "All right," he said, "if that's how you want to play it." There was no sound after that, no retreating footsteps, no rustle of movement outside. Just silence. Carter motioned to Davis, who nodded and carefully cracked the blinds to peek outside. "He's gone," Davis murmured. "At least, I don't see him anymore." "That doesn't mean we're safe," Carter said, his jaw tight. Stay on high alert. He doesn't do anything without a reason. Hannah exhaled slowly, her hands trembling as she tightened her grip on the bag. The tension in the room was suffocating, but her mind was fixated on one thing. The notebook. Hayes knew about it. He knew what it meant. And Carter hadn't denied it. What did he mean? She asked, her voice breaking the silence. About the notebook? Carter turned to her, his expression unreadable. He's trying to rattle you, Hannah. Don't let him get into your head. Stop lying to me, she said, her voice sharper than she'd intended. He knew about my mom, about the symbols, about everything. How could he know that? Carter opened his mouth to respond, but Davis cut in, his tone low and urgent. Movement, he said, his eyes still trained on the window. Far side of the tree line, can't tell how many. Carter's expression darkened. He's not alone, damn it. The tension snapped into action as Carter moved toward the door, his gun raised. He glanced back at Davis. Stay with her, he ordered. Don't let anyone in. Davis nodded, shifting his position to block Hannah from the door. She felt her pulse quicken, her mind racing as Hayes's words continued to echo in her head. Don't trust them. They want the notebook. She stood abruptly, clutching her bag. I need to know what's going on, she said, her voice trembling but determined. I deserve to know. Not now, Davis said sharply. You're staying here. I'm not a prisoner, she snapped, her frustration boiling over. You can't just keep me in the dark while… A sudden explosion outside cut her off, the sound deafening. The ground shook, and the lights in the cabin flickered before plunging into darkness. Davis cursed, pulling his gun and moving toward the window. Carter's voice came through the dark, steady but urgent. Hannah, stay down. Davis, watch the perimeter. Hannah dropped to the floor, her hands clutching the bag like a lifeline. Her breath came in shallow gasps as the chaos unfolded around her. The sound of footsteps, fast and purposeful, echoed outside, followed by another explosion, closer this time. And then, amidst the noise and confusion, a voice cut through the darkness, low and chilling. You should have listened to me, Hannah, Hayes said, his tone calm and unhurried. Now it's too late. The cabin descended into chaos. The second explosion had blown out the nearest window, sending shards of glass spraying across the room. Davis shouted something, his voice lost in the deafening noise, while Carter scrambled to secure the door. The air was thick with dust and the acrid smell of burning metal. Hannah stayed frozen on the floor, her heart pounding in her chest. Hayes's voice still echoed in her mind, calm and certain, as if he already knew how this would end. Now it's too late. Stay down, Davis barked, his back pressed against the wall as he aimed his gun toward the broken window. We're surrounded. Carter crouched near the door, his expression grim. They're not trying to get in. Not yet. They're hurting us, Davis muttered, forcing us to react. Hannah's grip on her bag tightened. Her breath came in short, sharp gasps as the reality of the situation hit her. This wasn't just Hayes playing mind games. This was an ambush. And they were trapped. Carter glanced at her, his voice firm but calm. Hannah, listen to me. We're getting you out of here. Stay low and follow our lead. No, she said, surprising herself with the force of her response. I'm not going anywhere until you tell me the truth. Carter blinked, clearly taken aback. This isn't the time. Then when is it? She snapped, her voice rising. You've been lying to me since this started, both of you. I'm not running blind anymore. Davis shot Carter a look, his jaw tightening. We don't have time for this, he said tersely. Carter hesitated, his gaze shifting between Hannah and the door. Another explosion rocked the cabin, this one farther away but still close enough to rattle the walls. He exhaled sharply and turned to her, his expression hardening. All right, he said. You want the truth? Fine. The notebook you're carrying. Your mother wasn't the first to find those symbols. She wasn't working alone. Hannah stared at him, her blood running cold. What are you saying? She was part of something bigger, Carter continued, his voice low but urgent. An investigation into a black market network that's been operating under the radar for years. Drugs, weapons, human trafficking. It's all connected. Those symbols are the key. Key to what? She demanded. To the players, he said. The ones running it, people with power, influence, people who would do anything to stay hidden. Davis cut in, his voice sharp. And Hayes is one of them. He's been covering for the network, protecting their operations while feeding just enough intel to stay untouchable. Hannah shook her head, disbelief washing over her. Then why didn't you tell me? Why keep this from me? Carter's expression softened, just slightly. Because the more you know, the bigger the target on your back. Your mother wanted to protect you, and so do we. Her stomach twisted at his words. Protect her? By keeping her in the dark? By treating her like a pawn in a game she didn't even understand? She clenched her fists, her frustration boiling over. I don't need protection, she said through gritted teeth. I need answers. Before Carter could respond, a burst of gunfire shattered the night. Davis ducked instinctively, returning fire through the broken window. They're closing in, he shouted. We're out of time. Carter grabbed Hannah's arm, pulling her to her feet. We'll finish this later, he said. Right now we have to move. Hannah yanked her arm free, her anger flaring. You don't get to decide what I do anymore. Listen to me, Carter said, his voice rising. If Hayes gets his hands on you or that notebook, it's over. For all of us. His words hit her like a punch to the gut. She hesitated, torn between her anger and the undeniable truth in his voice. Another explosion rocked the cabin, and this time, the roof groaned under the strain. Hannah! Davis shouted, his voice strained. We have to go. She looked at Carter, then at Davis, then down at the bag in her hands. The weight of the notebook felt heavier than ever, like it was pulling her into a decision she couldn't take back. Finally, she nodded. Fine, she said, her voice trembling. But if you lie to me again, I'm done with all of this. Carter didn't respond. He just grabbed her arm and pulled her toward the back door, Davis close behind. The three of them moved quickly, their footsteps barely audible over the sounds of the chaos outside. As they slipped into the darkness, Hannah's mind raced. Hayes had said she was playing a game she didn't understand, but now she wasn't so sure. Maybe she was starting to understand after all, and the truth was more dangerous than she'd ever imagined. The forest was a dark maze, the faint glow of the burning cabin flickering through the trees behind them. Carter led the way, his movements sharp and deliberate as he cleared a path through the underbrush. Davis brought up the rear, his gun drawn, his head swiveling at every sound. Hannah followed in the middle, her breath coming in ragged bursts as the weight of the notebook pressed against her chest. The night felt alive with tension. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, sent her heart racing. She couldn't tell if the sounds were real or just her paranoia, but either way, they didn't stop. Hayes's voice still lingered in her mind, calm and mocking. Now it's too late. Carter slowed, motioning for them to stop. He crouched low, scanning the area ahead, his eyes sharp and focused. We're not far from a secondary safe house, he said quietly. A mile, maybe less. Do you think they'll follow us? Davis asked, his voice just above a whisper. They'll follow, Carter replied. Hayes won't stop until he gets what he wants. Hannah couldn't hold back any longer. Why is this notebook so important? She asked, her voice trembling but firm. What's in it that he's willing to kill for? Carter glanced at her, his expression unreadable. You already know, he said simply. I don't, she insisted. I drew it. I wrote everything down, but I don't even know what it all means. Davis cut in, his voice low and urgent. It means you've been keeping track of things that people don't want the world to see. Connections, codes, locations. The kind of information that gets people killed. Hannah froze, her breath catching in her throat. She looked down at the bag, suddenly feeling like it was a ticking time bomb. But I didn't know. You don't have to, Carter said, his tone softening. You've been carrying it all the same, and that makes you a threat to people like Hayes." Before she could respond, the crack of a branch to their right made all three of them spin. Carter raised his gun, his finger hovering over the trigger, while Davis moved to shield Hannah. The silence that followed was suffocating, broken only by the faint rustling of leaves. Carter held up a hand, signaling for them to stay still. "Stay low," he whispered. "Don't move." Hannah crouched, her heart pounding in her ears. She clutched her bag tighter, her fingers trembling as her mind raced. Was it Hayes? His men? Someone worse? The silence stretched on, the tension unbearable. Then suddenly, a figure emerged from the shadows. Hannah's stomach dropped as the dim moonlight illuminated Marcus Hayes, his hands raised in mock surrender. "Didn't think you'd get rid of me that easily, did you?" he said, his tone calm, almost amused. He took a step closer, his eyes locking onto Hannah. "We need to talk." "Not one more step," Carter warned, his gun trained on Hayes' chest. Hayes ignored him, his focus entirely on Hannah. "You're smarter than they give you credit for," he said, his voice almost gentle. "You figured it out, haven't you? That notebook. They're not protecting it. They're controlling it." "Shut up," Carter snapped, his tone cold and sharp. "You're done, Hayes. You have nowhere left to run." Hayes' smirk deepened. "Run? Why would I run? I'm exactly where I need to be." Davis stepped forward, his gun aimed at Hayes' head. "We're not playing your games. Get down on the ground, now." Hayes didn't move. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. "You still think you're the good guys, don't you?" he said quietly. "You think she doesn't see it? The way you're using her? The way you used her mother?" Hannah's breath hitched. "What are you talking about?" "Don't listen to him," Carter said quickly. "He's trying to manipulate you." "Am I?" Hayes said, his gaze never leaving hers. "Or are they just afraid you'll start asking the same questions your mother did? Afraid you'll realize that the people pretending to protect you are the same ones pulling the strings?" Hannah's grip on the bag tightened, her mind spinning. Carter and Davis's silence was deafening, their guns still trained on Hayes, but their eyes flickering with something she couldn't quite place. "You're lying," she said, her voice shaky but defiant. "You're just trying to confuse me." "Am I?" Hayes took another step closer, ignoring the warnings from Carter and Davis. "You've seen it, haven't you? The way they talk around you, the things they don't tell you. Ask yourself this, Hannah. If they're so trustworthy, why didn't they tell you about the tracker in your bag?" The words hit her like a physical blow. "What?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Don't listen to him," Carter barked, but his voice faltered, and that hesitation was enough. Hannah's hands flew to her bag, her fingers frantically searching the seams. Her breath caught as she felt it. A small, hard device sewn into the lining. A tracker. Her eyes shot up to Carter, betrayal written across her face. "You knew," she said, her voice breaking. "You knew, and you didn't tell me." "It's not what you think," Carter said, his tone desperate. "It was for your safety." "For my safety?" She cut him off, her voice rising. "Or so you could control me." Hayes' smirk returned, his eyes glinting with satisfaction. "Now you're starting to get it." Davis stepped forward, his gun still aimed at Hayes. "This is exactly what he wants," he said. "He's twisting everything." "Am I?" Hayes asked again, his voice soft but cutting. "Or are you just mad she's finally seeing the truth?" Hannah's mind reeled, her world unraveling around her. She looked between Carter and Davis, their tense stances, their carefully crafted words, and then back to Hayes, whose calm, calculated demeanor seemed almost honest by comparison. She didn't know who to trust anymore, but one thing was clear. She couldn't stay here, not with them, not with any of them. Her grip on the bag tightened. "I'm done," she said, her voice shaking but resolute. "I'm done with all of you." And before any of them could stop her, she turned and ran. Hannah's feet pounded against the forest floor, her breath tearing from her lungs in ragged gasps. The bag swung against her side, a constant reminder of the weight she carried. Not just the notebook, but the truth she was beginning to uncover. The voices behind her were a jumbled blur. Carter shouting her name, Davis barking orders, Hayes's calm but relentless tone still echoing in her ears. Her thoughts raced faster than her legs. A tracker. They were tracking me this whole time, for my safety or something worse. She didn't know where she was going, but she knew she had to get away from all of them. The dense woods closed in around her, shadows twisting with every step. The sharp snap of a branch to her right made her stumble. She whipped her head around, her heart lurching, but saw nothing. The forest was alive with the sounds of pursuit, footsteps, rustling leaves, muffled voices. She couldn't tell who was following her. Hayes? Carter? Both? Neither option felt safe. She pressed on, ducking under low-hanging branches and leaping over roots. Her mind replayed the moment she'd found the tracker, the cold confirmation that her trust had been a mistake. They lied to me, just like Hayes said. The thought sickened her, but the alternative was no better. Trusting a man who had haunted her every step. A light ahead caught her eye, faint but steady. She slowed, her instincts screaming at her to be cautious. As she crept closer, she realized it wasn't a light. It was a phone, its screen glowing in the dark. It lay abandoned on the ground, its faint illumination casting eerie shadows on the leaves. Her chest tightened. A trap. She hesitated, scanning the area around her. The forest was silent now, unnervingly so. She crouched low, her fingers brushing the edge of her bag as she considered her options. She could leave it and keep running, or take the risk. Before she could decide, a figure emerged from the shadows. Her breath caught as Marcus Hayes stepped into the light, his expression unreadable. "You're fast," he said, his voice calm, almost conversational. "I'll give you that." Hannah scrambled back, her heart hammering. "Stay away from me." "I'm not here to hurt you," Hayes said, raising his hands. "You know that by now." "I don't know anything," she snapped, "and I don't trust you." He tilted his head, studying her. "No, but you don't trust them either, do you?" She glared at him, her mind warring with itself. He took a slow step closer, his movements deliberate. "Here's the thing, Hannah," Hayes continued. "You're out of moves. They've been lying to you from the start. Everything they've done, every decision they've made, has been to control you. To control that notebook. They don't care about you, they care about what you can give them." "And you do?" She shot back, her voice trembling. "You've been following me, threatening me." "I've been trying to protect you," he interrupted, his tone sharp. "Because I know what they'll do to keep their secrets buried. I've seen it. Your mother saw it. And now, so have you." His words hit her like a punch to the gut, stirring the doubts she'd tried to suppress. She shook her head, backing away. "You're just trying to manipulate me." Hayes sighed, his expression softening. "Believe what you want, but if you go back to them, they'll take that notebook and you'll never see the truth. You'll never know what really happened to your mother." The mention of her mother made her chest tighten. "What do you know about her?" she demanded. Hayes hesitated, and for the first time she saw something in his eyes. Hesitation, maybe even regret. "She was brave," he said quietly, "but she was outnumbered, just like you." Before she could respond, a voice cut through the trees. "Hannah!" Carter's voice, loud and urgent, echoed through the forest. It was followed by Davis's. "We're coming." Hannah's eyes darted between Hayes and the direction of the voices. Her mind raced, her instincts pulling her in different directions. Run, hide, confront. Hayes stepped back into the shadows. "You don't have much time," he said. "Choose carefully." And then he was gone, leaving her alone in the dark. Carter and Davis burst through the trees moments later, their flashlights sweeping across the forest floor. Carter's gaze locked onto Hannah, who stood frozen in place, her bag clutched tightly to her chest. Relief flickered across his face, but it was quickly replaced by something harder. Determination, or maybe control. "Hannah," he said, his voice firm. "Are you all right? Did he hurt you? She shook her head, her breath coming in shallow gasps. No. Davis scanned the area, his gun drawn. Where is he? Gone, she said quietly. He left. Carter stepped closer, his eyes narrowing. What did he say to you? Hannah hesitated, her grip on the bag tightening. Nothing, she lied. He didn't say anything. Carter's jaw tightened. Hannah, I said he didn't say anything, she snapped, her voice rising. Why does it matter? It matters, Carter said, his tone hardening. Because every word out of his mouth is designed to twist you against us, to make you doubt everything we're trying to do. Hannah glared at him, her chest heaving. Maybe I already do. The words hung in the air like a slap. Davis glanced at Carter, his expression darkening. We need to move, Davis said. We've wasted enough time. Carter nodded reluctantly, but his eyes didn't leave Hannah. We're not done talking about this, he said. Without waiting for a response, he turned and started walking, motioning for her to follow. Hannah hesitated, her feet rooted to the ground. Her mind was a whirlwind of doubts and fears. Hayes's words echoed in her head. Choose carefully. She looked down at the bag in her hands, the notebook inside like a secret begging to be unleashed. She didn't know who to trust, but she knew one thing. Whatever was coming, she had to be ready. And for the first time, she wasn't sure she was. Hannah stood at the edge of the clearing, the weight of the notebook in her hands heavier than ever. Carter and Davis were ahead, their voices sharp, urging her to follow, but she didn't move. The choices she had made, the truths she had uncovered, had left her fractured, unsure of who to trust or what to believe. For so long she had wanted answers. About her mother, about Hayes, about the tangled web of lies and conspiracy she'd stumbled into. But now she realized something. The answers wouldn't bring her peace. They wouldn't undo the loss or make the pain disappear. The truth was a weapon, and like any weapon, it could be used to protect or destroy. She tightened her grip on the notebook and turned to Carter, her voice steady despite the tears in her eyes. I'll give you this, she said, holding up the bag. But on one condition. You stop treating me like a pawn. You tell me everything. No more secrets. Carter met her gaze, his expression softening. You've earned that, he said quietly. I promise. With trembling hands, she handed over the notebook, the weight lifting but leaving behind an ache she couldn't name. As they walked back through the forest, Hannah realized she wasn't the same girl who had entered this fight. She had faced the darkness, and though it had scarred her, it hadn't broken her. Her mother's bravery lived on in her, a reminder that even in the face of betrayal and loss, she could choose to be stronger. The truth had cost her, but it had also set her free. And as she stepped into the uncertain light of a new day, she knew she would never be powerless again.